There's an old idea, hidden beneath the dust of temples and the weight of centuries, that the deepest power inside a human being does not wake through force. It does not wake through struggle, noise, ambition, or endless motion. It wakes in silence. This is where the ancient current of Thoth begins. Not in a battle, not in a revelation of fire and thunder. It begins in the quiet place most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Imagine entering a chamber so still that even your breathing feels too loud for it. The walls are cold stone, marked with symbols that seem less carved than remembered, as if they were always there, waiting for a mind clear enough to see them. There is no command spoken to you, no grand figure standing at the center to announce the mystery. The teaching arrives in a more unsettling way. It lets you hear yourself. At first, what you hear is not wisdom. It is noise. You hear the mind rehearsing old conversations. You hear fear dressed as planning. You hear the endless narration that follows every feeling, labels every moment, predicts every danger, and speaks so often that most people mistake it for their true self. This is the first veil. Thoth, in the ancient imagination, is not merely a keeper of magical secrets. He is a master of measure, language, memory, rhythm, and cosmic law. And to stand before such a mind, the seeker must first realize one difficult truth. The inner voice that chatters all day is not the throne of consciousness. It is only the surface. Most people live at that surface forever. They think their unrest is life itself. They think their mental movement is proof of intelligence. They think that if the mind keeps working, they are awake. But the old wisdom says the opposite. A person can be mentally busy every waking hour and still remain spiritually asleep. In fact, constant mental noise is one of the surest signs of sleep because it keeps the deeper faculties buried. It keeps perception shallow. It keeps attention fractured. It prevents the soul from hearing the quieter signal underneath. That quieter signal is what Thoth points toward. Not a new belief, not a dramatic conversion, a deeper level of awareness that has always been present, but drowned out. You do not create it, you uncover it. This is why silence was never treated as emptiness in the ancient world. Silence was a doorway. In Egyptian sacred thought, order arose from the unseen before it appeared in form. The visible world came from hidden principles. What is above reflects what is below, but what is below can only understand what is above when the confusion inside it settles. The restless person cannot read reality clearly because reality is subtle. Its laws are patient. Its messages do not shout. So the first code of awakening is not to gain more thoughts. It is to stop obeying every thought that appears. That sounds simple until you try it. The moment you sit still, the mind becomes louder. It throws old memories into the room. It pulls unfinished fears from the dark. It invents urgency. It tells you that now is the wrong time to be quiet, that there are more practical things to do, more immediate worries to solve, more proof to chase. But this resistance is part of the teaching. The noise grows sharp because it senses it is being observed. What once ruled you, without question, begins to weaken when seen clearly. And that act of seeing is the threshold. There comes a moment, sometimes brief, sometimes almost too delicate to notice, when you stop being completely fused with the motion of thought. A fear passes by, and you notice it without entering it. A memory rises, and you let it move through without giving it a throne. A sentence forms in the mind, but something older and steadier remains behind it, watching. That still presence is the beginning of inner power. Thoth's code, in this sense, is not secret because it was hidden by priests alone. It is secret because the modern mind is trained away from it. People are trained to react at once, speak at once, consume at once, decide at once, and fill every empty space with distraction. Silence becomes uncomfortable because it threatens the false center built by habit. Yet in that discomfort lies the first crack in a shell. Once the shell begins to break, a different relationship to life starts to emerge. You notice how much of your suffering was not the event itself, but the storm of commentary around it. You notice how often the mind speaks in borrowed voices, repeating family fears, social pressures, old wounds, and inherited limits. You notice that what you called yourself was often only a collection of reactions. And beneath all of it, like a hidden current under rough water, something remains untouched. That untouched place is not passive. It is not numb. It is deeply alive. It is the inner chamber where attention becomes clear enough to receive truth without distortion. In the language of myth, this is the place where the sleeping power first stirs. Not because you have seized it, but because you have finally stopped drowning it out. And in that first silence, with the mind no longer speaking over the soul, you begin to understand why the ancient masters guarded quiet so fiercely. They knew that before the hidden power within can rise, it must first be heard. And once that inner noise begins to loosen its grip, something else becomes possible. You start to hear the difference between a mind that merely reacts and a mind that creates. In the silence beneath thought, another truth begins to rise, and this is where the teaching grows more powerful. Because Thoth is not only a guardian of hidden wisdom, he is also a lord of language, measure, sacred writing, and the living force behind the word itself. He belongs to that ancient understanding in which speech is never treated as a casual thing. A word is not just a sound. It is a movement of power. To the modern ear, that can sound symbolic, poetic, maybe even exaggerated. But the deeper you look, the less abstract it becomes. Every human life is shaped by words long before it is shaped by actions. A child hears who they are before they know how to choose who they will become. A civilization names what it fears, what it worships, what it rewards, and what it refuses to see. A wounded mind repeats private sentences so often that they harden into identity. A hopeful mind does the same. Most people do not realize how much of their world was spoken in a form long before they called it reality. This is part of the ancient code. Thought is not empty. Language is not neutral. Symbol is not decoration. These are instruments of formation. They shape the invisible architecture from which visible life begins to take its pattern. That is why sacred traditions place so much weight on names. To name something was never just to label it. It was to enter relationship with its essence. To know the true name of a thing meant touching the order hidden within it. In a mythic atmosphere around Thoth, writing itself becomes more than communication. It becomes a bridge between worlds. A sign carved in stone, a word spoken with intention, a symbol held in concentrated awareness. These are not separate from reality. They are ways consciousness leaves an imprint upon it. You can feel this even without entering a temple. Think of what happens when a single sentence lives inside you for years. Maybe someone once said you were weak, difficult, forgettable, too much, not enough. The words vanished into the air, but they did not disappear. They entered your inner structure. They became part of the unseen script through which you interpreted every challenge, every rejection, every silence from others. In time, those words began arranging your world for you, not with magic in the childish sense, but with something far more constant. Perception followed language. Expectation followed perception. Choice followed expectation. Life slowly bent around an old sentence until it felt like fate. Now reverse it. Imagine that a human being learns to see language before it becomes destiny. Imagine they begin listening carefully to the phrases repeated inside their own mind. Not just the dramatic ones, but the small, ordinary ones. I never get what I want. People always leave. I am too late. I do not have what it takes. Nothing changes for me. These quiet spells are often more powerful than grand declarations because they are spoken with faith. They are spoken again and again until the soul starts acting as if they are law. This is why Thoth's wisdom feels so sharp even now. It asks a question that many people avoid for years. What words are you living inside? Because the mind does not only describe reality, it helps prepare the ground from which your reality is experienced. Every repeated phrase strengthens a path. Every symbol held with devotion gathers force. Every inner statement becomes a subtle instruction to the body, the emotions, the imagination, and the will. A person who constantly says the world is against them will begin to read the whole sky as evidence. A person who learns to speak from inner authority begins to gather themselves differently. Their posture changes. Their attention changes. Their action stops serving old chaos and starts serving a new order. This is not about shallow positivity. The old teachings are far deeper than that. They do not ask you to lie to yourself with pretty language while your inner life remains divided. Words gain force when they are joined to awareness. When spoken from sleep, they scatter. When spoken from presence, they begin to align the inner world. And this is where symbol enters the mystery. Ancient symbols were not designed merely to decorate sacred walls. They were visual forms of invisible principles. The feather, the scales, the moon, the ibis, the scribe's mark, the geometry of the temple itself. Each carried an idea beyond literal meaning. To meditate on a symbol was to train the mind into resonance with a deeper law. Symbol bypassed the noisy surface and spoke directly to the older layers of consciousness. It taught without argument. It moved through image, rhythm, proportion, and association. It planted a reality before the rational mind had time to resist it. Even now, your life is full of symbols, though many arrive unnoticed. The spaces you live in, the images you consume, the stories you repeat, the words you attach to success, failure, love, power, and the self. These are shaping you. They are writing in you. They are building the temple or darkening it. So the second movement in this awakening is not merely to become quiet. It is to become precise, to speak more carefully inside your own being, to stop feeding your life with language that weakens it, to understand that every time you say, "I am," something listens. Something organizes around that statement. The sleeping power within does not rise in response to random speech. It rises when word and awareness begin to move together. And when that happens, you start to sense why the ancients treated language with reverence. A clear thought becomes a tool. A chosen symbol becomes a guide. A spoken intention becomes a line drawn through chaos. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly at first, the world within begins to change its shape. And once the inner world shifts, the outer world no longer meets the same person it met before. As the inner word becomes clearer, another boundary appears, and this one is harder to cross because it is made of things most people spend their lives trying to escape. The ancient path does not lead only into light. It leads into what the light has been avoiding. This is where the teaching of Thoth becomes severe in the most necessary way, because the sleeping power within is rarely hidden beneath comfort. More often, it is sealed behind fear, pain, shame, grief, and all the unfinished forces a person has pushed into the dark corners of the self. This is why awakening is so often misunderstood. Many imagine it as a gentle rising into peace, as if truth appears only through beauty, harmony, and elevated thoughts. But the older wisdom is less sentimental. It knows that a human being is not weakened only by what happens to them. They are weakened by what they refuse to face in themselves after it happens. Anything you bury without understanding does not vanish. It waits. It gathers force below the threshold of awareness. It becomes a silent influence, shaping reactions, distorting desire, clouding judgment, and draining vitality from places you can no longer name. The ancient code does not ask you to hate the darkness in you. It asks you to enter it with a lamp. That is the difference between being consumed by shadow and learning from it. Shadow, in this sense, is not evil in the theatrical way people sometimes imagine. It is the rejected self. It is everything the conscious mind decided was too painful, too dangerous, too embarrassing, too raw, or too confusing to hold in the open. It may be rage that had no safe voice. It may be sorrow that never found language. It may be desire judged too harshly. It may be fear disguised as perfection, control, indifference, or constant busyness. Whatever form it takes, shadow grows powerful when it remains unseen, because what remains unseen often begins to rule from beneath. This is one of the great paradoxes hidden inside spiritual traditions. The very things that seem to block your power are often standing guard over it. Think of how much energy is required to avoid yourself. Think of how much life is spent managing appearances, softening truths, numbing discomfort, rehearsing identities, protecting old wounds from being touched. This constant inner defense consumes an enormous force. A person may call themselves tired, unmotivated, confused, spiritually disconnected, but beneath that fog there is often a simpler fact. Their energy is trapped in suppression. The power they long for has not disappeared. It has been bound up in what they have not yet turned toward. This is why the descent matters. In the symbolic world around Thoth, wisdom is not shallow brightness. It is measured awareness. It is the capacity to endure truth without running from it, to descend into yourself without becoming lost, to stand before what has frightened you and remain conscious enough to listen. That takes courage of a quieter kind in battle. It is easier to fight an enemy in the open than to sit still in the presence of your own hidden pain and ask what it has been trying to teach. At first, what emerges may feel unpleasant. Old fears may not appear as dramatic visions. They may come as a tightness in the chest when life asks for change. Old shame may rise as hesitation, as the feeling that you should remain small, unseen, safe, and acceptable. Old grief may appear as numbness, as the inability to fully feel joy because the gates of feeling were partially closed long ago. These are not interruptions to the path. They are the path. The places where life has frozen inside you are the very places where fire must return. And this return of fire does not happen by denial. It happens by contact. The moment you stop fleeing a fear and begin observing it, it changes. The moment you stay with a painful truth without collapsing into it, something in you grows stronger than the pain. The moment you allow an old sorrow to be felt instead of endlessly managed, the frozen energy around it starts to loosen. This is the alchemy hidden inside the darkness. What seemed like weakness begins releasing force. What seemed like damage begins revealing intelligence. The shadow does not only contain wounds. It also contains instincts, gifts, passion, clarity, and lost fragments of the self that were exiled simply because they were too intense for a younger version of you to carry. So much of awakening is really a return of exiled life. That is why the hidden power feels so strange when it first begins to rise. It does not always arrive as serenity. Sometimes it arrives as a deep, honest anger that finally shows you where your boundaries were broken. Sometimes it arrives as grief, so pure it washes years of deadness from the heart. Sometimes it arrives as a fierce clarity that can no longer pretend, can no longer bow to what is false, can no longer keep living according to fears inherited from the past. There's fire in that. Not destructive fire alone, but sacred fire. Fire that burns away confusion. Fire that reveals structure. Fire that gives warmth back to the parts of you that went cold in order to survive. This is why the ancients so often placed treasure in caves, wisdom in the underworld, gods in hidden chambers, and transformation in nights of trial. They understood something modern life often forgets. The soul does not become whole by remaining pleasant and untouched. It becomes whole by reclaiming what was lost in darkness and carrying it upward without distortion. And once you begin to do that, the darkness no longer feels like the opposite of awakening. It begins to feel like its furnace, A hidden place where fear was guarding strength, where sorrow was guarding depth, where shadow was guarding fire. And in that fire, the sleeping power within starts to remember that it was never dead. It was only waiting for someone brave enough to enter the dark and bring it home. Once that hidden fire is no longer feared, it must be shaped. This is where many seekers lose their way, because awakening power is only one part of the ancient work. Power without measure becomes distortion. Force without inner order becomes another form of sleep. Thoth stands at this threshold not as a figure of wild ecstasy, but as a keeper of balance, proportion, and sacred intelligence. He belongs to the deeper law that says nothing truly great can remain alive in a human being unless it is held in right measure. This is the part of the path that feels less dramatic from the outside and more demanding from within. It is one thing to touch silence. It is one thing to reclaim buried energy. It is another thing entirely to become steady enough to carry what you have awakened. The sleeping power within does not rise, so you can be overwhelmed by your emotions, seduced by your desires, or intoxicated by your own intensity. It rises so you can become a vessel strong enough to hold a greater force without breaking your center. The ancients understood this through the image of the temple. A temple is not sacred only because of what enters it. It is sacred because of how it is built. Its lines are measured. Its spaces are ordered. Its chambers are arranged with purpose. Nothing essential is careless. In the same way, the inner life must be constructed with a kind of quiet discipline. Thoughts, desires, fears, speech, appetites, and impulses all have their place, but none of them can be allowed to rule the whole structure. The self becomes clear when each force is given its measure. This is why balance is not a soft idea in ancient wisdom. It is a law of strength. A person who cannot govern anger will call their chaos passion. A person who cannot govern desire will call their compulsion freedom. A person who cannot govern fear will call their avoidance wisdom. Without measure, even powerful experiences become misleading. The awakened energy that should illuminate the soul can easily feed vanity, self-importance, obsession, or spiritual fantasy. The seeker begins thinking they are expanding, when in truth they are only being pulled around by undisciplined forces wearing sacred language as a disguise. Thoth's code cuts through that illusion. It asks for sobriety of soul. It asks you to become honest enough to see what rules you when life presses on your weak places. This does not mean becoming cold or rigid. It does not mean strangling emotion or living in constant self-control. The old law of balance is more alive than that. It is about harmony, not suppression. Emotion is not the enemy. Desire is not the enemy. Ambition is not the enemy. Even pleasure is not the enemy. The problem begins when any one force grows so loud that it disturbs the order of the whole being. Then the inner temple tilts. Attention becomes unstable. Judgment becomes clouded. Power leaks away through extremes. So awakening asks for a more refined strength. The strength to feel deeply without being ruled by every feeling. The strength to want something intensely without becoming a servant to craving. The strength to remain open without becoming directionless. The strength to act with conviction without losing humility. These are not small achievements. They are signs that the inner architecture is becoming sound. This is also why patience becomes sacred on this path. A mind trained by speed wants instant transformation. It wants revelation without practice, power without discipline, depth without self-examination. But the inner temple is not built in a moment of inspiration. It is shaped through repeated acts of alignment, through choosing clarity when confusion is easier, through returning to stillness when distraction is more tempting, through speaking carefully, feeling honestly, and refusing the extremes that once tossed the self from one side of life to the other. Little by little, balance stops feeling like restraint and starts feeling like freedom. You realize how much energy was once lost to contradiction. One part of you wanting truth, another part demanding comfort. One part longing for growth, another clinging to old identity. One part calling for silence, another addicted to noise. The more these forces are brought into harmony, the more life begins to move through you without such resistance. What was once scatter gathers. What was once reactive becomes deliberate. What was once fragile becomes quietly powerful. And that quiet power has a very different presence from ordinary force. It does not need to display itself. It does not rush to prove its depth. It does not demand constant recognition. Like a well-built temple, it holds. It stands. It remains. In that state, the sleeping power within is no longer a sudden flame appearing in flashes. It becomes a steady light, something governed, integrated, and real. And only then does the seeker begin to understand why Thoth is a master of measure. Because the soul does not awaken fully through intensity alone. It awakens when every part of the being learns to stand in right proportion, and the inner temple becomes worthy of the force now living inside it. And when the inner temple has been measured, steadied, and made ready, something extraordinary begins to happen. The power that once appeared only in glimpses, in moments of silence, in flashes of truth, in the slow return of buried fire, no longer feels distant. It no longer feels like a visitor. It begins to take its seat. This is the final movement in the ancient code, not the discovery of some foreign force entering from beyond, but the recognition that what you were seeking has been waiting at the center of your own being all along. Thoth's wisdom, at its deepest level, does not point toward dependence. It points toward remembrance. The sleeping power within is not a gift given to a chosen few. It is the hidden birthright of consciousness itself. Though most people live at such a distance from their own center that they experience that birthright only as a hunger they cannot name, there comes a stage in the path when that hunger changes. It stops feeling like lack. It starts feeling like approach. You begin to notice it in small ways first. A challenge appears, and where panic once rushed in, there is space. Someone misunderstands you, and where the old self would have scrambled for approval, something calmer remains in place. Desire rises, fear rises, memory rises, but none of them seize the throne. They are present, yet they are no longer sovereign. Beneath them, deeper than them, there is a seated awareness that has begun to know itself. This is the coronation no outer world can perform. Ancient myths often speak in images of crowns, thrones, scepters, hidden kings, veiled queens, and sacred chambers, not because they're obsessed with royalty in the ordinary sense, but because sovereignty is one of the clearest symbols for awakened consciousness. To awaken is to stop living as if every passing impulse is your ruler. It is to reclaim the governing center of your life. It is to remember that the self, when rightly ordered, is not a battlefield of competing voices. It is a kingdom whose true authority has returned. That return does not make you separate from life. It joins you to it more fully. The awakened self is not detached in the cold sense. It feels more, sees more, understands more. It becomes more intimate with reality because it is no longer constantly twisted by inner confusion. It sees patterns that once seemed hidden. It senses when speech has power and when silence has greater power. It knows when to act and when to wait. It stops chasing intensity for its own sake because it has touched something greater than excitement. It has touched inner authority. An authority of this kind is quiet. It does not need constant proof. It does not announce itself in every room. It does not need others to kneel before it because it no longer kneels before every passing storm inside. This is why awakened people can appear ordinary from a distance. They may speak gently. They may move simply. Yet around them, there's often a different atmosphere, as if something in them has become settled into its rightful place. Their words carry more weight because they come from alignment. Their presence affects others because it is not scattered. Their lives begin shaping reality not through forceful performance, but through coherence. Thought, word, feeling, and action begin to move in the same direction. This is the true sign that the sleeping power has risen. Not visions alone, not moods of temporary transcendence, not borrowed spiritual language. It is the growing unity of the self. And with that unity comes a strange and beautiful reversal. The world that once seemed to control you completely begins to lose some of its tyranny. Praise does not intoxicate as easily. Rejection does not destroy as easily. Uncertainty does not paralyze as easily. You are still human. You still feel. You still grieve, desire, wonder, and struggle. But now there is something seated deeper than circumstance. A center that does not vanish every time life changes form. This is why the old wisdom feels so magnificent. It does not flatter the seeker with fantasies of escape. It offers something nobler. It offers mastery through remembrance. It offers the return of the inner ruler who is sleeping beneath noise, beneath fear, beneath old language, beneath disorder. And once that ruler wakes, life itself begins to look different. Every moment becomes a field of correspondence. Every decision becomes an act of alignment or misalignment. Every word becomes a seed. Every silence becomes a chamber. Every trial becomes a chance to remain seated in what is real. In that state, Thoth is no longer only a figure from the ancient world. He becomes a symbol of awakened intelligence within the human soul, the scribe of inner law, the witness who records whether you live from your center or abandon it. And the final secret is this: awakening does not end in a single revelation. It becomes a way of being, a way of seeing, a way of inhabiting your own life with a dignity that cannot be borrowed from the outside. The throne was never empty. It was only forgotten. And now, after silence, after the discipline of the word, after the descent into shadow, after the measure of the inner temple, the one who sits there at last is not a stranger. It is the deepest you, ancient and immediate at once, remembering its own power. Now the chamber grows quiet again. The symbols on the walls seem less like mysteries carved by distant hands and more like reflections of laws already written inside you. The mind is no longer begging for constant movement. The heart is no longer fleeing its own depth. The self is no longer scattered among old fears, borrowed voices, and restless hungers. Something has gathered. Something has taken form. Something that was sleeping has opened its eyes. And in that stillness, you understand the code was never merely meant to be studied. It was meant to be lived. So as the final echoes fade, you do not leave this inner temple with the feeling that you have collected ideas. You leave with the quieter, stronger sense that a forgotten center has been touched. The silence beneath thought is still there. The shaping force of the word is still there. The fire hidden in darkness is still there. The sacred measure of the soul is still there. And above them all, within them all, the awakened self now sits where it was always meant to sit, watching, choosing, creating, remembering. Let that image remain for a moment longer, not as fantasy, but as direction, a throne of consciousness within your own being, a presence that does not tremble before every change in the outer world, a deeper intelligence that knows how to wait, how to see, how to speak, how to endure, and how to act when the hour arrives. This is the sleeping power Thoth guarded in symbol and story, not a power to dominate others, but a power to cease being ruled by what is lower, weaker, and more chaotic within yourself. A power of inner kingship, a power of lucid presence, a power that becomes real the moment you stop searching for it only in distant heavens and begin recognizing it in the quiet authority of your own awakened soul. And now the path grows softer. The urgency falls away. There is nothing left to force, nothing left to chase. Only the slow settling of a truth that may have been with you from the beginning, waiting patiently beneath all the noise of life. You were never empty. You were never cut off from the sacred source of meaning. You were never without a center. What slept within you was not absence, but memory. Not weakness, but unopened strength. Not darkness alone, but light folded inward, waiting for the hour when you would finally become still enough, honest enough, and brave enough to let it rise. So breathe once more into that ancient chamber. Feel the calm weight of stone, the hush of unseen space, the sense that something vast and intelligent has been present through every stage of your journey. Not outside you only, but within you, quietly shaping every moment in which you chose awareness over noise, truth over comfort, order over confusion, and presence over fear. This is how the sleeping power awakens. Not all at once, and not through spectacle, but through remembrance deep enough to change the whole structure of a life. And when that remembrance becomes steady, the soul no longer wanders like a stranger through the world. It walks as one who has returned to the throne within. The night is deep now, but it no longer feels empty. It feels watchful, alive, as if the silence itself is listening. Somewhere within that silence, beneath all the names you have carried and all the versions of yourself you have outgrown, there's a presence that has never been broken. It has waited through confusion, through fear, through longing, through all the years spent searching outside for what could only be awakened within. Let yourself rest near that thought, not as a demand, but as a gentle truth. The soul does not bloom under violence. It opens when it is met with enough stillness to remember its own shape. The ancient code of Thoth is not only about hidden wisdom from a vanished world. It is about the timeless art of becoming inwardly whole, of hearing more clearly, seeing more truly, speaking more carefully, standing more steadily inside your own life. Perhaps that is the real wonder of all sacred teachings. They survive because they're not only about the past. They're about the structure of consciousness itself. They speak to the same chambers in every age. The same fear, the same hope, the same sleeping fire. And each time a human being turns inward with courage, each time they choose awareness over distraction, they reopen that ancient path. So let the symbols fade now. Let the temple walls dissolve back into the quiet of your own breathing. Let the story become a feeling, and the feeling become a presence. You do not need to hold every word. You only need to keep the flame. A little more stillness, a little more honesty, a little more balance, a little more trust in the deeper self that has begun to wake. And as you leave this inner chamber, carry one final knowing with you. The power you seek is not rushing away. It is not reserved for someone wiser, stronger, or more chosen than you. It is here beneath thought, beneath fear, beneath all the noise, waiting with extraordinary patience for the moment you remember how to listen,